Good afternoon.
My name is Al Ortega, and with Joseph Lennon here in front, we're co-directors of the Villanova Strategic Initiative for Climate Justice and Sustainability. In case some of you don't know, this initiative is a coalition of faculty members across campus who care about topics related to climate and sustainability. Our ultimate aim is to create an institute, a university institute, a well-funded university institute. Maybe in the future sometime there will be a building dedicated to these topics on campus. We hope so. So one of our activities this year is to host this speaker series. So welcome to the first speaker of the 2024-25 speaker series. The hope for this is to provide a forum for some of our brilliant researchers who are working in these areas. And the idea being that we need to know what each other is doing so that we can understand what scholarship is in sustainability and climate, and possibly form multidisciplinary teams. So before introducing our speaker, I'd like to invite Professor Lennon, Joseph Lennon, to make a few announcements about upcoming activities that are related to the initiative.
That's what's recording. This is the mic. Hello, everyone.
Oh.
I just wanted to briefly say thank you, Todd, for being here today. There are several events coming up on campus. The first is called Envisioning the Environment, and this is art and sustainability. It's an student art show, and it's on display in the commuter lounge in Connolly Center starting. The opening is November 13th from 4 to 6. November 13th is also the day of the unveiling of Villanova University's mural project on sustainability. It's a mural of the Sustainable Development Goal number 12, and schools all around Philadelphia are doing this, and this is our contribution. Number 12 is on sustainable consumption and development, which is something that Father John Abu Bakar, the Chief Sustainability Officer here at Villanova, is passionate about. Two other things. November 7th, this week, CBEST, the Center for Biological and Biodiversity and Systems, is hosting an environmental stewardship and community workshop at 5:30 in the Villanova room. That's November 7th. And lastly, on November 21st, as part of GEV's speaker series, Jane Clougherty is speaking. So these are all on the newsletter that is sent out through the Office for Sustainability. If you'd like to subscribe, look them up. Just Google Villanova Sustainability, and it'll bring you to that office. So thanks, and I'll turn it back over to Al. Thanks.
So Professor Todd Agard is our guest speaker today. So Professor Agard is a professor in the Charles Widger School of Law, and I'd like to say that Todd has been one of the most active members from the very beginning of the steering committee for the initiative, and we greatly appreciate him continuing to do that. In fact, because he suggested that we do this speaker series, we stuck him with the job of being the first speaker. I'm really grateful. Anyway, Todd asked us to keep it short, and I'll ask him to make other comments about his passionate interest in sustainability. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks very much, Ron. So rather than have a formal introduction, I thought maybe especially because I think one of the purposes of this series is to get to know each other as scholars, whether we're students and teachers or teachers and teachers. So I just wanted to explain sort of my background. So I always wanted to do environmental work from a very young age, long before I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I went to undergrad thinking that, and I worked a little bit for an EPA contractor between undergrad and law school. I went to law school thinking I was not going to be a lawyer because everybody had warned me that lawyers are horrible people. And then got to law school and loved it. So I went to law school at the University of Michigan that also has a School of Natural Resources. Now there's a School of Environmental Studies. So I got a master's in environmental policy at the same time that I was getting my law degree. So unusual for academics. Lawyer academics, for the most part, we don't get PhDs. There are some who get so JD is the law degree. Most of us just have a JD. So one of the great things about being a legal academic is you can be a lawyer and all of a sudden say, I think I want to be an academic. and do that without having to go get a PhD somewhere. So that's what I did. I worked for 8 years out of law school at the Department of Justice handling environmental cases. And thought like I really want to think more deeply about some of these issues. I really like working with the students that I work with, so I think I want to go into teaching, and I got a job here and I've been here too long. Not too long, but like longer than I would like to acknowledge that I'm old. So about 17 years now. So a couple of things about environmental law that I wanted to explain is, so in environmental law, we kind of divide the field into subfields, and some people work across subfields and some don't. So roughly speaking, you can think of environmental law as pollution law. So things like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act that limit the amount of pollution that can go into the environment. There's what sometimes is called birds, bees, and trees, or natural resources law, which is more about like endangered species, biodiversity, forest management, things like that. And those are particularly important out west, where there's a lot of public lands, but also important things like the coastal fisheries and things like that. Energy law, which is one of the areas that I write in, is kind of, it's been its own thing and is increasingly becoming intersected with environmental law. So I am particularly working at the intersection of energy law, where we get our energy from, and pollution law. So I'm really interested in finding ways to get our energy with especially less climate pollution, less carbon pollution. And so that's what this project that I'm going to present is on. So another thing about environmental law, in my field, when we present, we tend not to present work that we've already sort of done, but what we call works in progress. So what you're seeing is an article that I have not even written yet. In fact, what I've written is mostly just on these slides. And we tend to present for a relatively short time and then like a lot of discussion. So I'm going to hope that we can follow that. I'll give you like maybe 20-ish minutes of summarizing my thoughts so far, and then I would love to get questions about anything, but especially any ideas that you all have about some of the ideas that I present. So, So I'm going to break the talk down into sort of 3 different parts. First, I'm going to talk about the politics of energy policy, a very brief history over time of the politics of energy policy. Then I'm going to put that in what's almost really more of a political science framework of how to think about the relationship between policies and politics, a sort of theoretical framework, and then hopefully bring those 2 ideas together and talk about how we can think about energy politics and what the public interest is in energy politics. So first, let's talk about the politics of energy policy. To understand the politics of energy policy, I think it's helpful to have just a little bit of background about where we are and where we've been in terms of our energy use. So this is U.S. energy consumption by source. And it's a fascinating history. So from the founding of the Republic, and so some really interesting things. So for the first 100-ish years of the United States, we relied primarily on wood, right, which is a biofuel. And so that was our primary source of energy. Then you have the age of coal. So in 1885, coal surpasses wood. You see the sort of ups and downs of coal, but mostly up. So like between 1900 and 1950, a lot of coal use, rising petroleum use. Natural gas is a big one, right? And then coal precipitously down. So more recently, I'll talk about this one and then also show, I think some of the most interesting things are, one is you can see that renewables have significantly increased in the last 10 years. So if you look at renewables over time, they're definitely, the last 10 years are different. And the extent of renewable use is far greater now than it has been at any time in our history. At the same time, in the last 10 years, there's been a precipitous drop in our use of coal, but also a great increase in our use of natural gas. So if you think about the last 10 years, yes, we have more renewable energy. We are using more renewable energy than we ever have before, and that's some of what has displaced coal. But overwhelmingly, it's this relationship that accounts for our changes in our energy sector over the last 10 years of natural gas displacing coal. Not primarily by any policies that we have, but just by the fact that with fracking and horizontal drilling, natural gas is significantly cheaper than coal at this time. And so you see coal plants being retired or underutilized, natural gas plants being used to a much greater extent. Petroleum is to a great degree its own thing because it's largely used in transportation. You haven't seen much displacement there. even though there are natural gas vehicles and starting to be more EVs. So far, petroleum has not suffered. So these ups and downs are really more having to do with economics than they are with fuel use transfer to other sources. So here's the more recent, the last few years. And so coal, you see, is really the only one that is going down. We see natural gas increasing to fill some of that space, petroleum staying relatively equal, and then we have the renewables and nuclear up there. Any questions about that so far? Okay. So part of the story that we want to tell about the history of energy use in the United States is the long history of fossil fuel subsidies. And so here are just some examples to give you an idea of what I mean by fossil fuel subsidies. So there are certain costs in the petroleum sector or the oil and gas sector that are tax deductible, which is a form of incentive, right? Favorable tax treatment of something is a way in which we subsidize it. So tax deductions for drilling costs is just one example of many favorable tax treatments that we have for the oil and gas industry. When we have energy development on federal lands, we have tended to charge below market lease rates and royalty rates. So it is cheaper than what would happen on the open market to extract oil and gas from public lands in the United States. That's another way in which we subsidize the fossil fuel industry. And then a final one is that is not often thought of as subsidy, but really is there's a lot of regulatory exemptions for the oil and gas industry. So just to name a couple of them. The Superfund statute that covers environmental contamination exempts petroleum. The federal statute that governs hazardous waste exempts certain oil and gas waste that are produced from oil and gas production. When we give more favorable regulatory treatment for things just because they come from fossil fuels, that is a form of a subsidy because other similar forms of environmental pollution are not getting that favorable treatment. So that differential treatment is a form of a subsidy. So when you think broadly about fossil fuel subsidies, it's not just what we tend to think about of tax subsidies, but a variety of other ways in which we get favorable treatment. Now, these subsidies are not an accident. They arose out of a certain politics. The fossil fuel companies, and we often lump electric utilities in with fossil fuel companies because electric utilities they're different, right? They're generating electricity, but they have tended to be literally and figuratively invested in fossil fuels because they have power plants that run off of coal and natural gas. The fossil fuel and electric utilities have always invested heavily in lobbying. To give two big examples, the petroleum industry has the American Petroleum Institute, one of the best funded and most powerful lobbying institutions in DC. The electric utilities have the Edison Electric Institute. These are very powerful players in the energy market. A lot of money is invested by the fossil fuel industry in these entities. Historically, the subsidies that we have in fossil fuel, those that I just reviewed, those come as a result of that advocacy, right? There's a direct relationship. There's a reason why the fossil fuel companies are investing so much in their lobbying because it is getting them favorable policies. But it's not just, I think if you think of it only as sort of crass lobbying, I think you miss something. That I think that the fossil fuel industry and the energy sector have for a long time successfully told a story to policymakers that energy equals industrial development equals economic development. So I think they have successfully convinced policymakers that we need cheap energy in order to fuel the economy, and so we need policies that give us cheap energy. And so when you see these examples of these subsidies, it's not just these companies going to their members of Congress or to the agencies and saying, do this for us, you owe us, but also a pitch of, hey, we need to help the U.S. economy. We talk about things like energy independence, our reliance on other countries. And so, so there is this pitch that I think has largely been successful of tying energy to industrial development and saying we need to help energy in order to assist industrial development. Now, I don't want to act like everything that we do in policy today has been only for the benefit of fossil fuels companies and electric utilities. So there are certain notable exceptions from the overall trend. The first is there's something called electricity restructuring. So the traditional way that we got electricity was through monopoly utilities. So you may remember back, if you've been around this area since before the 1990s, PECO used to own everything, right? You would own the power plant, the electricity wires, and substations, everything from power plant to your door would be owned by utility. In the 1990s, for a variety of reasons, policymakers such as the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission started breaking up some of these utilities. So now Pennsylvania has a competitive electricity market, meaning that generators, so power plants, are owned by different companies that compete in the market to sell their electric power to then the distribution utilities. So that was something that was not directly for the benefit of the utilities. In fact, they strongly opposed it. They liked the government-granted monopoly that they had. So that was a significant development that did not happen at the behest of either the fossil fuels or the electric utility. Since 2010, as I mentioned, natural gas has largely displaced coal. Coal is on its way out regardless of any environmental policies or other energy policies, being displaced by natural gas purely for economic reasons, that it is just cheaper to get electric power from natural gas now than it is from coal. And so there's been that. That's not a policy change, but it's a very important change in the sector since 2010. And then around the same time, there's been a real rise in renewable energy. That has largely been as a result of government policies to assist and promote renewable energy. We are now at this point, however, that because of those policies, renewable energy is often the cheapest form of power available. So, and I already showed you that, I explained that. Oh, so what I wanted to here just point out is, so if you look at where we get our energy from, petroleum and natural gas still greatly, greatly outweigh renewables, right? If you add up 38% and 36%, that's a lot more than 9%. So if you look at that, you'd say we're really heavily, heavily still dependent on petroleum and natural gas, much less on renewables. But if you look at where we are adding capacity to get electric power, it's an entirely different story. So this is U.S. electricity generation additions. I think this was for last year. We have solar, battery, wind, nuclear, right? Like, this is natural gas, and this is other. Almost all of these are clean energy sources. So it's a totally different story of where new energy is coming from versus where our existing energy is coming from. So slowly we are moving, turning over, or rapidly, depending on how you think about it, moving towards getting more of our energy from renewable and clean sources. But we are still largely dependent on fossil fuels. So what do we see? We have explosive growth of renewable energy. Favorable policies are an important driver of this growth. I'll give you some examples of some of these policies in a second. So most of our energy is still from fossil fuels, but most of our growth in energy use is coming from renewable energy. So here's some examples of some of these renewable energy subsidies, just like I gave the example before of the fossil fuel subsidies. There are tax credits for renewable energy investments or production. So if you build a wind turbine and it starts to generate electricity, you can take a tax deduction either on your investment in that wind turbine or production of power from that wind turbine. There are a lot of state policies, Pennsylvania has one of them, that require a certain amount of electricity to come from renewable sources. So that's another, it's forcing people basically to buy renewable energy. And then finally, there's grants and research for new emerging technologies that have really in the past benefited the development of new technologies and now are currently trying to benefit things like geothermal, advanced geothermal. So these are all ways in which our current public policies are moving renewable energy forward and advantaging renewable energy. Now, on the politics of this, so I talked about the politics of fossil fuel support for energy. What are the politics of renewable energy politics? When we first started doing this, there was no renewable energy sector, so there wasn't an industry that was lobbying on its own behest. Most of the political support for these renewable energy policies came from environmental groups. But, and this is one of the key points of my talk, as the renewable energy industry has, or as renewable energy has grown, the renewable energy industry has grown, And as it has grown, it has started lobbying. So here's a, unfortunately, monochromatic graph about over the last 20 years. So this is total lobbying expenses by the energy sector. This is the fossil fuel industry. These are electric utilities. This one is other energy, and the little tiny one here is renewable energy lobbying. So one thing that I want to show you is that both in terms of the absolute size and in the share of the overall industry, yes, lobbying overall has gone up, but the renewable energy industry has become a minority, but significant minority in lobbying. So it's a very sizable amount, and it's actually a significant, although minority, percentage of overall energy sector lobbying now that happens from the renewable energy industry. Now, this has caused some both glee and consternation amongst people that care about renewable energy. On the constant glee, because you have now an industry that's a political player that is able to try to get policy towards clean energy, and that's in many ways a favorable thing. On the consternation side, there is some concern that the clean energy industry has started to look more like the fossil fuel industry than maybe perhaps we'd like. And so this is an article from Greenwire about what used to be, I think, the American Wind Power Association is now the American Clean Power Association. They have sometimes taken positions at odds with environmentalists, and they have sometimes aligned themselves with the fossil fuel industry. Because some energy companies are invested in both fossil fuels and renewable energy, there are some members of the American Clean Power Association that are also fossil fuel companies, and so this has caused some consternation. Some people refer to this big green, the renewable energy industry kind of becoming a more traditional power player in politics. So from that, I want to take a brief detour to talk about some political science theory before we kind of bring it all together. So, if you've had any political science, maybe hopefully some of this seems a little bit familiar to you. The way that I think about these issues is through the prism of politics is interest group competition. That the way that politics happen is you have different interest groups that care about a particular issue. They compete with each other to try to get the most favorable policies, and the policies that we get are some sort of equilibrium amongst them. So to give an example of something totally different, legalized gambling. There would be some people that would mobilize because they're against gambling, because they think, for example, it operates as a regressive tax, or they think it's immoral, or at least something that we shouldn't be allowing. It has certain externalities. There's going to be groups that are invested in gambling that want to have more gambling because they're going to make money off of that. They're going to each lobby different policymakers that are making decisions, and what we see, the result should be some equilibrium amongst their competing interests. Maybe reflective of their relative resources, maybe reflective of their relative support among the population, but somehow they kind of battle each other, compete with each other for favorable policies. So in other words, politics, or things like our political preference, operate through interest groups to yield certain policies as a result. Now there's kind of two different ways in political science to think about what results we get out of that interest group competition. One that views that competition relatively benignly, and one that views it more cynically. The benign view is often known as pluralism, and this is the idea that probably what we get is something that approximates the public interest. That if the amount of resources that are being invested by the different interest groups roughly reflect the support that they get from the population, then what the outcome that we get from their competing with each other is those groups that have the most support are the ones that are going to get the most results. And so the outcome that we get is some sort of socially beneficial outcome. That's known as pluralism. Public choice theory is a cynical view, and it sees it not as a fair competition, so not as a level playing field. It thinks that special interests that have concentrated benefits from policies are going to be able to invest more and organize better and are going to tend to win. So the cynical view of public choice theory is that when you have interest group competition, it's not the group that has the most public support that wins, but rather actually the group that has the narrowest concentrated benefits, which is often, for example, a regulated industry rather than public interest. So now, Chuck was saying, well, are you going to talk about what regulatory rents are? Finally, regulatory rents. So regulatory rents is actually a term that primarily comes from economics. So the term rent in economics does not mean like what you pay your landlord, but rather it's, if you think of it as sort of excessive profit. There's a certain amount of profit that you need to make in order to make an investment worthwhile, right? So think about like the money that the bank gives, like the interest that you receive on a savings account. That is in some sense profit that you're making, but that's how the bank has to do that in order to induce you to deposit your money, or else they wouldn't do it. So, but if there's something more than what is necessary just to compensate you, so compensation beyond what is economically or socially necessary is known as economic rent. Another way of thinking about that is money that would not be made in a competitive market. So for example, in a monopoly market where there's a monopolist that doesn't face competition, the excess price that they charge consumers as a result of the monopoly power is a form of economic rent. It is a way that an economist measures basically loss to society, because if we're paying too much, we should be using that money for something else. So if there's not a social benefit, if we're paying more than economically or socially necessary, we're losing money that we could put to some other good purpose. Regulatory rent are just a subset of economic rent, of rents that come from excessively favorable policies. So when you have a policy that unnecessarily benefits somebody, such that they're making more money than is economically or socially necessary, that is, we can refer to that as a regulatory rent. Another way of thinking about this is just regulatory rents are a word for bad policy. Excessive policy is unnecessary policies. So, one way of thinking about are our policies good or bad is, are they allowing someone to gain regulatory rents or are they not? Our goal there for policy making should be to accomplish our objectives without getting regulatory rents. And you can see where this is going, right? We're going to talk about the energy industry and think, are our incentives targeted only as necessary to accomplish our regulatory objective, or are we actually giving someone more profit than they need and therefore creating regulatory rents? Our goal for energy policy should be to incentivize clean energy transition without creating unnecessary regulatory rents. But there's a complication to this so going back to our politics and policies, so before I made the point of the arrow going this way, politics through interest groups affects the policies that we get, but actually, as some political scientists have pointed out, the effect goes in the opposite direction as well. Sometimes the policies that we have affect the politics of those policies, and I think energy policy is a great example of that, renewable energy policy in general. I'll give you an example when we get to the renewable energy sector. So, the public interest favors a clean energy transition that will depend on renewable energy. I am committed to the idea that we need renewable energy. I don't want anybody to come away from this talk thinking I'm disparaging renewable energy or in favor of it, more use of fossil fuels. But the interest of the renewable energy industry is not in advancing the clean energy transition, it is in making profits. The renewable energy industry wants to make money, and that's how they're going to act. So, one of the main points of my talk is we should not equate, even though we want renewable energy, we should not equate the renewable energy's interest in making profits with our interest in having more clean energy. They're not the same thing necessarily. Sometimes they may be similar, but they're not always the same thing. So, policymakers should create processes and seek outcomes that protect the public interest and avoid equating the renewable energy's interest with the public interest. In other words, I said before, when I talked about fossil fuel subsidies, that I think that the fossil fuel industry successfully convinced us for a century that aiding them is aiding the public interest because it promotes industrial development. I think there's a danger that to some extent we are being fed the same line by the renewable energy industry now, that we should do whatever they want because they are helping us with the clean energy transition. We need rather not to protect against creating regulatory rents. We should seek policies that neutrally advance public interest objectives. So I'll give you an example of this. If what we want is to have less carbon pollution, from our energy use. We should reward anything that gets us less carbon pollution from energy. So maybe that's a commitment to nuclear. Maybe that's a commitment to conservation. Maybe that's a commitment, right? Like, could be a variety of things. When you see an incentive that is specifically targeted at, for example, solar or wind, and doesn't treat everything equally, you have to be concerned that you're creating biases in the policies that unfairly or unnecessarily favor one type of clean energy over another. So what this is going to require us to do is to figure out what exactly do we want from the clean energy transition, which is sometimes difficult to figure out, right? It's not just mitigating climate change, but then try to find neutral ways to advance that objective without falling into the trap of advancing one particular interest. A twist on that, though, is that this is all like theoretical, right? But in reality, sometimes the policy that you get is through some political process of, for TAD or log rolling or whatever. And so sometimes it's difficult to figure out what truly is necessary in a pragmatic sense. Maybe you sometimes do have to give somebody something that they don't truly deserve, but in order to make it part of a broader political bargain. Okay, so conclusions, and then hopefully we'll have some good time to talk. The energy policy overall has this history of supporting regulatory rents for the fossil fuel and electric utility industries. What I want to do is avoid repeating that history with renewable energy. So as renewable energy policies have taken hold, they have grown the renewable energy industry. It is still absolutely outgunned by the fossil fuel and electric utility industry, but it's starting to be a powerful lobbying source. And I want to make sure that we distinguish between renewable energy as defined by the public interest and the regulatory rents that renewable energy industry is seeking. For example, it probably is in the public interest to have time limits on tax incentives for renewable energy, right? Once renewable energy becomes sufficiently cheap or sufficiently expensive, we may not need to offer it tax breaks anymore. The renewable energy industry is never going to say, we don't need tax breaks anymore, we're okay, charge us more, right? They are always going to be claim that those tax breaks are necessary for them. And so one of the things that as policymakers or as public interest advocates that we need to do is push back on the idea that just because the renewable energy industry says it needs something, that they deserve that thing and it would be in the public interest to have that thing. We can do that by having policies and processes that aim for outcomes that avoid regulatory rents. We need to be on the outlook for policies that aid renewable energy in ways that bias the market or are unnecessary for accomplishing what's in the public interest. So that's my thoughts, and so I look forward to questions about anything.
I'll just let Todd address his own questions.
Okay, sounds
Open,
good.
floor is open.
I got it. Good.
So I have a question about how you quantify all this. So how do you know when a regulatory rent exists? So in the example of, well, you don't want to specifically incentivize solar necessarily, you want to do all renewables. Really, if your actual goal is limiting carbon pollution, you don't just want renewables, you want nuclear too. So like, how do you know, and some of these things might not be obvious until after the fact. You might realize, here's a policy, and then you say, oh, this policy created a bias that we had anticipate.
Yeah. Well, so hopefully you know in advance, right? So I think this idea of neutrality is a very effective tool. So one of the things that economists love a carbon tax, right? They would always go with a carbon tax. Why? Because what it does is it says what we care about is carbon. So let's charge everybody that emits carbon an equal amount because everybody's carbon is equal, right? So this is a sort of inherently neutral policy. Whereas if you have tax breaks, it's much, much more difficult to figure out how much of a tax break do we give solar, right? Because what you would like to say is, solar, we will give you a tax break to the extent that you are displacing carbon, which is incredibly difficult to figure out, right? How much carbon are you displacing by building this solar farm? It's really difficult to figure that out. And so some policies, yeah, it's going to be almost impossible to figure out what is neutral, and others actually it's sort of built into the policy to make them more neutral. that's one of the reasons why economists tend to like the idea of like, if it's carbon that you're worried about and tax carbon, don't be trying to get down to the weeds because you're going to get it wrong.
So that might lead you towards certain kinds of incentives.
That's right.
Most others.
Exactly. Ideally, what you would like, I think, if you're going to go with tax incentives,
Right.
ideally what you would like is a tax incentive that is valued by the carbon displacement.
Right.
You could try and figure that out. At least trying to figure out would probably be better than right out your hand. You get this much because you're lobbying us this heavily, and you get this much, right? I guess another thing that I'll add to this is I think it's interesting to think about the different policymaking institutions. So you have something like Congress or a state legislature versus an administrative agency like a public utility commission or the Federal Regulatory Commission. You might think that they are more or less responsive to political lobbying versus sort of technocratic public interest calculation. And so that might lead to saying, let's do this in an agency rather than in a legislature because we don't trust legislatures to sort of be unbiased, right? They're always going to be trading for political benefits because that's how you get elected. Right? Maybe there's a little bit of insulation. Joe.
My question, thank you very much for this talk, it's really illuminating. My question is if maybe we can zoom out a tiny bit further also to think about controlled markets like in China, producing a lot of solar and wind right now.
Yep.
And that we're purchasing. And we could also add in the potential of new tariffs coming in. So in a controlled marketplace, I'm assuming that regulatory rents are not as big of an issue, or I mean, how do we?
Or it's like everything.
Or it's everything is
because
so maybe just
because
yeah.
right, because one of the ways that you can, now I think this is a little bit too limited, but an economist would often measure rents as anything that departs from the outcome of a competitive market.
Right.
When you have like the way that the Chinese are subsidizing production of some of these renewable energy technologies is not competitive.
Right.
And so they are essentially heavily they are creating their own subsidies, right? Why are they doing that? They're trying to gain the market and displace competitors. So I would say they're sort of like, they're just very
Are
explicitly
they operating as one big company?
in a way, yeah, in a way. But there's all sorts of regulatory rents there, but they have nothing to do with the environment and everything to do with China's vision of who it wants to be competitively in the world. But there's still regulatory rents there, right?
Does that affect us?
Oh, absolutely, right. But less so. Actually gets quite interesting there because on the one hand, if what you want is more renewable energy, the fact that China is subsidizing renewable energy technology that it sells to us is making renewable energy cheaper, and so allows us to more readily access renewable energy. To the extent that you're thinking more broadly of a fair marketplace in which an American producer of solar panels can fairly compete with a Chinese producer, right? There's a fundamental problem there of one gets heavily subsidized and one has to sort of compete and gain back its own costs. So it kind of depends on what question you're asking, right? Like what are you worried about? In some sense, so and I think you see this in the clean energy industry here. The makers of clean energy technology hate the Chinese subsidies. I'm not sure that the people that are installing solar panels do, right? Because they are able to sell at a lower price because they're getting those panels at a lower price. Joe.
Sure. So I know that there was a FERC decision recently that was 2-1 that said no to Amazon's behind-the-meter connection to a nuclear facility in Pennsylvania. And basically they said that it was going to increase costs for us consumers, and you know that Amazon basically shouldn't be getting special treatment to sneak into nuclear power that would otherwise be going to the public. And Chairman Phillips, Willie Phillips, dissented. It was a 2-1 decision, and he was saying, no, this is stifling innovation, and in the long run, AI is going to be better, and it's going to make everything more efficient, and it's actually going to be good. And I've heard that argument also from, I think Google has made a similar argument. And so I'm curious how you think about the trade-offs between accelerating artificial intelligence and them just trying to be good lobbyists and get into our access to affordable power.
I think, yeah, I can't solve that, but I think it's a great illustration of how complicated this idea of the public interest can quickly become, right? So I framed it as this, like, well, just don't do more than is necessary. But many policies that we have a variety of different objectives. And so advancing our technological innovations, right? Like many people believe that at the same time that AI is taking tremendous amounts of it, consuming tremendous amounts of energy, that also it is a way in which we can live in a much more sustainably because it can help us do what we do more efficiently. Trying to figure out how that fits into the public interest, right? Like it complicates this like 100-fold, 1,000-fold. So in some ways, I don't purport to have any answers there, but I at least think we should be asking the question, right? So it may be really difficult in that particular circumstance to say, is it in the public interest or not in the public interest to allow Amazon to buy this power from this power plant? I'm more concerned with when we say public interest, are we really focused on what's good for the public as opposed to trying to unnecessarily subsidize or acceding to somebody's lobbying or political power? So I'm not really answering your question, but today I think it's a great illustration of how difficult and complicated this question is.
So my question is actually somewhat related to his. I know you've got Big Green that wants the subsidies, whatever, for solar. You've got the American Petroleum Institute who doesn't. They say, let them compete with us in the market. Oil's cheaper for now, let us win. Where does big tech come down on that? Because they've made these pledges to be carbon neutral by 20 whatever. But on the other hand, of course, they're huge consumers of energy, so they want cheap energy. So they're a powerful lobbying group. Where's big tech fall on this?
Yeah, fascinating. So I think right now what you see more of is the technology companies that are massive energy consumers. Many of them have been far more than any public policy, but committed to use of renewable energy. There's something called 24/7 renewable energy that is a particularly difficult way of getting renewable energy that many of them have committed to. So they are far beyond what even some of the most aggressive states are in what they're. So I think they are, and I think they're actually delivering on this. I see them pushing the renewable energy to be even more sustainable, even more efficient. So right now, I think they are doing more good to move us towards. Now, at the same time, they're a huge source of energy, right? And part of the problem, if what they're doing is buying renewable energy that you or I now are not buying, then that's a problem, right? So if they're getting clean energy, but the rest of us are getting dirty energy because they're taking all the clean energy, that's a problem. But to the extent that they are pushing the renewable energy industry to more sustainably produce electricity that then we can all benefit from, I think they're actually helping the public interest. So it's another good example, right? Because why are they doing that?
Right.
It's not out of philanthropy. They perceive some value to them of probably, I think that they are anticipating the pushback that if they were getting, say, coal power electricity, right, that would be really unpopular for people to say, like, when you use tech, you are polluting the environment. They would like to be able to say, don't worry about that, it's all clean energy. But it's interesting that I think there's an example of the opposite, of where their profit-seeking incentives are leading them to take a position that, at least in some respects, I think is more in the public interest than many of the public interest policies that we're seeing.
And I think I've read a little bit that some of it's coming from their employees as well. Like the employees are pressuring their company to reduce their carbon footprint.
Right, that might be, and certainly they have a particular type of employee that might be affected, right? Like where you have a labor pool that is highly educated and highly sought after, they probably have considerably more leverage than it's like Amazon and its work. Although Amazon also has done a lot.
And this was kind of alluded to as well, but the idea of not just transitioning to green energy, but where does the idea fit in that as we do certain things like AI, we need more overall energy, and so then the share might be different, but the growth in the use of energy, like is there just capping just like overall how much energy we're using, kind of fit into that? Or
Not capping energy use, but I think what is important about what you're saying is you have to look at all the different statistics, right? So for example, if I go back to this is a very optimistic graph because you look at this and you say, like, the clean energy transition, it's here, we're doing it. But then if you say, but all this is doing is adding on to our existing fossil fuel use so that we're not actually reducing our use of fossil fuels, then we're not fixing the problem at all, right? I mean, it's better, yes, than if that growth came from fossil fuels, but I think that's where it comes in, is you have to pay attention to that kind of loop of this, right? Is it market share that you're talking about? Because a bigger market share of a much bigger number is still bigger, right? So I think you have to be careful about what you're looking at. And if what you're really worried about is climate, we probably should just be looking at carbon emissions. How much carbon emissions are coming from the energy sector? And yeah, as we grow the sector. Now, give an example from environmental law, though, of a real success story there is cars and miles per gallon. So we have significantly reduced our emissions from cars in the United States since 1970, even as we have dramatically increased vehicle miles driven. So that's an example where we use a lot more of our cars, but we're actually getting a lot fewer emissions, even though we're driving them a lot more, which I think that's an example of how you can measure. Like, that's clearly success, to be able to get more while emitting less.
So Todd, if your mission was to educate a public that's not in your field, you really succeeded. I even like your fonts. So in my feeble brain, these regulatory grants in essence are contribute to your return on investment. If you're building solar farms, as a corporation or as a company, you seek investment.
Yep.
So in a sense,
and you are competing with other investment opportunities, right? So you need a certain return on your investment so that I'm going to invest in your turbine rather than Joseph's shoe factory.
right. So then,
But to the extent that you're offering even more than that, right? So say Joseph says, I can give you 5% return, and you say, I can give you 30. We might ask, why are you getting 30 from yours, right? Like something's off there. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So then, that's just my point. So then, in a sense, what you're proposing is limits or regulatory practices that limit what would be considered a fair return, right? Or is that right?
Or a necessary return.
Necessary return.
Exactly.
It's an economic policy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Again, I think there's a complication, and we can't only think of it in terms of economics, right? So say that we think that like energy independence for national security purposes is an important objective of our energy policy. Well, that's going to be something that, because a competitive market would say, who cares if you get your oil from Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, or Texas? It's all oil, right? But you might have national security reasons for why you prefer and should force us to not buy Iranian oil and buy Texas oil. Well, that's in some sense a bias in the market, but it's one that we think is in the public interest. So you can't just look at the economics of it, I think. Sometimes we have non-economic objectives in our policies. But obviously that makes it more complicated to figure out what's in the public interest, if not. Because everyone always has a good reason, right?
But that's the role of government, right?
That's right. Sort this out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Could you comment a little bit more on the carbon tax and where that is? Because you mentioned that as a possibility, but that's, I mean, at least from where a newspaper reader sits, that seems like it's not got a lot of legs right now. Or
Yeah, certainly not for the next month.
right now.
But where you, so it's easy to defeat politically because people hate taxes. Right? Even though economists will, the number of papers that have been written about how this is the cheapest way to make the clean energy transition happen, people don't care, it's a tax. But if we otherwise make and I'm not saying we're intentionally doing this, but every once in a while you actually hear someone in the energy industry say, let's just have a carbon tax. Because it's simple, we can plan around it, it's predictable, right? We know where it comes from. And so there is some possibility that if we, again, not intentionally, but if we enact such a mishmash of policies and have them coming and going, depend on our political whims, that at some point the industry would actually say, and this is kind of what happened in the 1970s with environmental policy. States were kind of all over the place. Courts were starting to do stuff. The reason why we have such environmental laws as we have is that at some point the industry said, we would rather just have a clear rule federally and stop all this craziness. So that's, I think, where I think it's going to politically always be a problem with the public. But at some point, if the industry got to the point where it said it would be better for us to just have a policy we can plan around that's built, that's fair, right? Because it's based on our carbon emissions.
Right.
Then maybe it's viable. Because then they can just call it something else, and as long as they don't call it a carbon tax,
Right.
it won't have.
So do you know of any other examples historically where there's been something where the externalities are not well baked in like that, and something like that tax would have been a simple solution that actually was successful, where we successfully accomplished that? Some other, maybe completely different policy?
I want to say that there are some things that operate like taxes. So the example that came to mind is ozone depleting chemicals.
Yeah.
Some of that has happened just through like bans, like some products. Some of that happened through charges that were levied on certain chemicals. And so in an ideal world, what that does is you can still buy it, but it's going to cost more. That leads producers of chemicals to innovate, come up with alternatives that are not going to be subject to that. Then once you have that alternative, it can outcompete because it's not subject to the charge. I believe, but I'm not an expert on this, that there's been some of that use of charges with ozone depleting chemicals to get innovations that have accelerated the move away from those chemicals into others. There also, the Inflation Reduction Act has, I think, some methane charges in it that are intended to try to induce the oil and gas industry to emit less methane during oil and gas production. Methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. And so I think the idea is maybe regulation, well, they couldn't do regulation in the Inflation Reduction Act because of the type of legislation it was, but the idea was maybe we can do it through the charges.
Limit fugitive emissions.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the.
Thank you very much, Kyle.